everybody. My name is Christina Wigren, and I am with Stilly Valley Health Connections. Thank you so much for joining us for this evening's class, which is focused on celiac disease and gluten intolerance. For everyone who is joining us live this evening, please note that the class is set up in a Zoom webinar format. This means that all of our participants are muted and your videos are turned off so that we can record this presentation. But if you would like to leave any questions or comments, this is encouraged, and we have a chat box and a Q&A box that you can find at the bottom of your screen. You can use either of those. Now I will pass it over to Anka from Sound Dietitians and Zainab from University of New England, who is working with Sound Dietitians, and they will be presenting for us this evening. So welcome on, you guys, and thank you to everyone who has joined us so far and to everyone who is watching this recording in the future.
All right, thank you, Christina. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining. Like Christina mentioned, you can leave your questions in the chat box or in the Q&A. We will have time at the end of the webinar to answer any questions, so please save them. Sometimes you'll find that as the webinar progresses, your questions do get answered. So we'll just read them out and I'll answer them at the end. So today we're talking about celiac disease and gluten intolerance. This is a subject that is near and dear to my heart. I actually have a family member that has celiac disease. I myself am gluten intolerant. So I feel like I have a lot of knowledge with this subject, but as somebody that has been through it and has seen, the progression of being diagnosed, dealing with it from a medical perspective and changing your entire life, I do want to say, it's really hard and you never stop learning. There's always new things that pop up, new research that comes out. So there's always new information out there. And I do want to say, so this particular class is more of an introduction of what celiac disease is and what gluten intolerance is and how to manage it. We're going to be talking a lot about food, grocery shopping tips, what to do at restaurants when you're traveling, things like that. This isn't intended to be medical heavy. I will say, if you have specific questions on how to deal with celiac disease or gluten intolerance and how to manage symptoms, it would be best to reach out to a registered dietitian or a medical professional that has experience with these issues and kind of work more one-on-one. So again, this is just going to be a really good baseline introduction on what these things are. And then, so these are our objectives for today. And Zainab, go ahead whenever you're ready.
Hi, everyone. So to start off, let's define what celiac disease actually is. Celiac disease is not a food allergy or any simple sensitivity. It's actually an autoimmune disorder. This means that when someone with celiac disease eats gluten, their immune system reacts by attacking the small intestine, and especially the villi, which are small finger-like projections that absorb nutrients. So damage to the villi can lead to malabsorption and it can result in a variety of nutritional deficiencies. It affects about 1 in 100 people worldwide. And although it's hereditary, it can develop at any age. So even if someone has eaten gluten for years, they can go years without noticing any issues. And people with the gene variants like HLA-DQ1 and HLA-DQB1 are more likely to develop the disease, especially if they have a first-degree relative with celiac disease. We now actually have blood tests that can check for these specific gene variants. Now, let's talk about some symptoms that are associated with celiac disease. These symptoms can vary depending on age and individual response. So in infants and children, we can see anxiety and depression, chronic diarrhea, constipation, delayed puberty even, and nausea and vomiting. And in adults, we can see symptoms like headaches, mouth ulcers, constipation, diarrhea, itchy and blistery skin. It's also important to note that these are just a few of the symptoms listed. There are more than 200 known symptoms, and this can make it very difficult to diagnose without proper testing. So yeah, I'll pass it back to Anka to talk about gluten intolerance.
Okay, so gluten intolerance is different from celiac disease. So gluten is still the issue, but it doesn't cause damage to the small intestine like celiac disease. You'll also hear gluten intolerance referred to as non-celiac gluten sensitivity, right? Some common symptoms include gas, diarrhea, constipation. So kind of similar to what you see with something like lactose intolerance. And typically gluten intolerance develops because our bodies don't create the digestive enzymes that it needs to break down that gluten. Similar to what happens with lactose intolerance as well. What we know though with gluten intolerance is typically symptoms do get better with a gluten-free diet, and it's also super individual. So some people that have gluten intolerance can tolerate small amounts of gluten. For example, if they, just drizzle some soy sauce on something, they might be fine. But if they eat a slice of gluten-containing bread, they might notice symptoms. So it's really individual, and seeing like what your individual sensitivity looks like and what volumes of gluten you can tolerate. And I do want to mention something that we're seeing more often with patients in practice is something called fructan sensitivity. So fructans are a type of carbohydrate. So you find them in a lot of things like fruits, vegetables, grains, beans, those types of things. And fructan sensitivity can actually have similar symptoms to gluten intolerance. And most gluten-containing grains are actually high in fructans, so it can make it really hard to differentiate what might be causing issues. Is it the gluten or is it foods that are high in fructans? And really the way that we can kind of tell that maybe gluten isn't the issue is when people start to react to other foods that don't have gluten but are high in fructans. So I just listed some options here. Onions, garlic, asparagus, beans, watermelon are just a few foods that are high in fructans, and all of these are gluten-free. So if you find yourself that you're reacting to some of these other foods along with gluten-containing grains, it could mean that maybe gluten isn't really the issue. And now we have a breath testing device that we can use to test for fructan sensitivity. It's called a food marble. It's basically you eat a food, you breathe into this device, and then it spits out a number. And based on what that number, if it's within range or not, it could show that you're actually reacting to that food. So if you are having some issues and you think it might be gluten intolerance, but maybe it might be something else, I highly encourage looking into this food marble device and, working with a dietitian to kind of get down to the bottom of what exactly is causing issues. And then Zainab, if you want to take it from here.
Yeah, so let's talk about where gluten is found and like the sources of gluten. The most obvious sources are wheat, rye, and barley, and all their varieties. This includes a lot of grains like semolina, farro, spelt, kamut, and more. There's also triticale, which is a wheat rye hybrid, and malt, which is derived from barley. Even brewer's yeast can sometimes contain gluten. So it's also important to watch out for wheat starch unless it's been processed to remove gluten. Um, so any food product that's made with these ingredients is not safe for someone with celiac disease. Then in terms of everyday foods, gluten shows up a lot in a lot of places that you might not expect. Some common foods include breads, pasta, baked goods, cereals, and even sauces and gravies. because lots of sauces and gravies are they use flour as a thickener. Beer is another one, unless it's specifically labeled gluten-free. It typically contains gluten. It's yeah, so it might seem easy to just avoid bread. The reality is that gluten is hiding in a lot of places, like in processed and restaurant foods. And some other potential sources of gluten are medications and vitamin supplements. They often contain gluten as a filler, so it's important to look for gluten-free labels in these as well. And even toothpaste, lip balm, and lipsticks can be a risk if they contain gluten and are accidentally ingested. Even for young kids, Play-Doh can be a hazard because it's wheat-based and because often kids put their hands in their mouths. So, and something we could consider is making Play-Doh at home instead. And so managing celiac disease isn't just about what you eat, it's also about being careful with what you use and what you touch. Yeah, now I'll pass it back to Anka to see.
Great. So, like Zainab said, there's a lot of different products out there that do contain gluten, and we'll talk a little bit more about how to read labels and what to look for in the next couple of slides. But why don't we talk about what are some foods that are naturally gluten-free? So foods that you don't have to worry about, right? So in terms of your grains, the following ones are going to be naturally gluten-free. So amaranth, quinoa, buckwheat, millet, polenta, which comes from corn, rice, teff, and sorghum. And any flour that you see made from these products is going to be gluten-free. A lot of the gluten-free flour blends that you see out on the market have some combination of these, along with things like starches that are typically gluten-free. And we'll talk about those in the next slide. So for oats, these are gluten-free. So if you have gluten intolerance, you can likely tolerate oats. If you have celiac disease, you need to make sure that you're getting oats that are certified gluten-free. And that is because oats are at increased risk for cross contact, partly because a lot of times oats are actually grown in fields next to wheat. So there can be some cross contact that happens where wheat accidentally gets in the oats when they're being harvested. And oftentimes you'll see that oats are processed in factories where wheat is being processed as well. And while they do typically, sanitize and make sure that the equipment is clean, there's no guarantee that wheat doesn't make its way into oats. So if you do have celiac disease, it's really important to look for certified gluten-free oats in any products that you use. Some other gluten-free foods include nuts and seeds, beans and legumes, any meat, dairy product, fruits, vegetables, spices, and herbs in their original unaltered form is going to be gluten-free. It's when we see additives or flavorings or things like that that start getting added into these products where we have to start reading labels. Okay. And then in terms of your more processed foods, your baked goods, breads, and pasta made with gluten-free ingredients are going to be safe. Same with sauces made with gluten-free ingredients. So tamari made without wheat. Tamari is a type of soy sauce. And this is actually one that I did not know about until recently, that not all tamari is gluten-free. I had never seen it in the grocery store where it was made with wheat, but I did see a social media post a couple weeks ago where somebody that had celiac found tamari that did have wheat in it. So that's a really good, learning opportunity. Just make sure that when you buy tamari, it does say gluten-free on it. Baker's yeast is also gluten-free. Yeast extract, if it is not made from barley. So if it is made from barley, it should say on the label. Same with dextrin. So dextrin can actually be made from wheat, but it is highly processed. So chances are it doesn't contain enough gluten to actually cause a reaction. You'll see it on a lot of websites that have resources for celiac disease where they say like dextrin is pretty safe because it's so processed that there's virtually no gluten left. Powdered sugar, if it's free from wheat starch. So sometimes they will put starches in powdered sugar to keep it from clumping, and sometimes those starches are wheat, are made from wheat. So making sure that there's no wheat starch in your powdered sugar. Same with modified food starch, making sure it's not made from gluten-free grains. And tapioca starch or cornstarch, those are naturally gluten-free. And gluten-free gluten-free beer specifically is safe. Just making sure you're reading your labels. And actually all distilled spirits, even if they are made from gluten-containing grains, are safe for those that have celiac and gluten intolerance. And that's because the fermentation process of the alcohol gets rid of all the gluten. Okay, so now we're going to switch over to kind of more safety tips for those with celiac disease. And we're going to start with grocery shopping. So again, these next couple of slides are going to be more geared towards celiac disease or things like gluten allergies or very severe gluten intolerances. Okay, so when we're grocery shopping, we want to make sure that we're checking labels and we're checking ingredient lists. So we're looking for ingredients that may contain gluten, right? And staying away from those foods. Another really important thing is to avoid bulk sections in the grocery store because these can be a high risk for cross contact. So you never know if maybe somebody switched the scoops, that maybe one was in a gluten containing bin, now it's in the one that's supposed to be gluten free, or you never know if somebody accidentally dropped something that contains gluten in what's supposed to be a gluten free product. It's better to be safe than sorry. So I highly recommend just going ahead and buying the packaged item instead of getting it from the bulk section. And using caution or completely avoiding prepared foods from hot bars, delis, or salad bars, because there is high risk of cross contact, whether that cross contact happens when the food is being prepared or as people are serving themselves. You can always ask the grocery employees how they prepare the food, if there was any consideration given to like allergies or anything like that. Sometimes they might know the answer, sometimes they don't. So again, use your judgment, but it's always better to be safe than sorry. And then be cautious with free samples. So even if the sample itself is gluten-free, you never know if maybe the person that's serving the sample touched something with gluten with their gloves and then they didn't change their gloves and now they're touching the samples. There's so many different times when cross contact can happen, and just being on the lookout for those as well. Okay, what about label reading? So these are three things that I typically look for and I tell my clients to look for. So the first thing is look for a gluten-free label. So if something is certified gluten-free or says that it's gluten-free, it's very likely that that food is safe. So certified gluten-free is going to be safe. But if it just says gluten-free, I would encourage you to also look at the ingredient list. So the FDA, for a food to say gluten-free on the package, the FDA requires that that food contains less than 20 parts per million of gluten. And that 20 parts per million of gluten, so that comes from a lot of research that has been done around celiac disease, and what they've found is most people do not react to anything less than 20 parts per million of gluten. And just to kind of put that in perspective, a crumb, like a breadcrumb, has more than 20 parts per million of gluten. So even like a tiny breadcrumb can still make somebody that has celiac disease sick. Okay, so even if you do see gluten-free on the label, I still encourage you to check the ingredient list. So checking the allergen listing and the contain statement. So in this next slide, we'll actually look at the contain statement and see what it looks like. So common allergens are typically listed on the packaging. This can be a really quick way to rule out a product if it says contain wheat, right? But a lack of allergen labeling does not mean that the product is gluten-free. It is actually not required for food companies to put a allergy listing or a contain statement. It is a completely voluntary process, although a lot of food companies do add that in for ease of the customer. But just know they're not required to actually tell you if there's an allergen in that food. And then checking for obvious ingredients and looking up ingredients that you're not sure about. If there's anything that you are not familiar with, it's totally fine to Google it and, figure out, is this product actually safe? So doing these 3 things, looking for a gluten-free label, checking the allergens listing contain statement, and then check for obvious ingredients, is going to be your best bet. And kind of going back to the gluten-free label, so you will see a gluten-free label if foods, for example, contain oats. But if it's not a certified gluten-free product, that might mean that there could be some contamination in those oats, so it's not safe for celiac disease. It is, however, safe for those with gluten intolerance. Okay, so this is a label. So on the left-hand side, this is actually the label for Ritz crackers that do contain gluten. So you'll see, the first ingredient, enriched flour. It has wheat flour. The rest of these ingredients are actually gluten-free. But you'll see this contain statement, which says it contains wheat and soy ingredients. So those are going to be your allergens. So, from the start, if it says contains wheat, that is not a safe product, right? On the right, we have the Simple Mills almond flour crackers. So here you'll see that it already has the certified gluten-free label. So from the start, like this is a safe product. You can also check the ingredient list. So you'll see it has nuts and seed flour, tapioca starch, cassava flour, and then the rest of these ingredients are also gluten-free. And under the contain statement, you see that they only list almonds. Okay, so I mentioned cross contact a couple of times in the last couple of slides. So what exactly is cross contact? So cross contact happens when a gluten-free food is exposed to a gluten-containing food, making it unsafe for people with celiac disease. So I hear a lot of people saying cross-contamination when they're referring to celiac disease, and cross-contamination only refers to when there's bacteria that gets transported from one food to the next. When we're talking about specific allergens being contaminated, we're talking about cross contact specifically. So cross contact can happen during the preparation process. So whether it's at home, in restaurants, or other food service establishments, or during the growing, processing, and manufacturing process, like we talked about with oats. So what can you do about cross contact and how can you keep yourself safe? So when we're talking about cross contact at home, one of the first things that I tell my patients to do is have a discussion with your family members about the importance of keeping gluten-free and gluten-containing food separate. So this is really important to make sure that everybody's on board. And some families will actually choose to keep their household completely gluten-free so that there's no risk for cross contact. But then when they leave the home and maybe they go to a restaurant or to somebody's house to eat, they might choose, the family members that can eat gluten might choose to eat gluten in that setting, but then keep everything gluten-free. It's really individualized around your family and what is the best for everybody to do, right? But there are specific things that you can do to prevent cross contact from happening at home. So one of the things includes using separate sponges and dish rags to wash gluten containing dishes. So, getting those different colors to make sure that you're not accidentally washing, a dish with the gluten containing sponge if it was meant to be to use the gluten-free sponge. If you are using a dishwasher, it is safe as long as the dishes do come out clean. It is safe to just put everything in the dishwasher just because of how long the washing cycles are. They typically are able to get rid of the gluten. Toasters are another big no-no for cross contact. So toasters, it's almost impossible to clean them completely. So making sure you're either using a separate toaster or you can buy toaster bags. You can get them off of Amazon. They're basically just a paper bag that you put your bread in, and it's supposed to keep it from touching the toaster. Just make sure that there's no crumbs that fall into the bag. Another tip, you can also just put your bread on a baking sheet and put it under the broil, and it'll do the exact same thing that the toaster does. If you have a convection oven, so a convection oven has a fan and it basically blows hot air throughout the oven. And as you can imagine, if you cooked something uncovered with gluten, maybe it fell in the oven and now you have the gluten being blown around by hot air, it can totally land on gluten-free food. So if you do have a convection oven, just make sure to cover your gluten-free food either with some foil or a lid to make sure that there's no gluten particles that are being blown into the food. Using separate cutting boards and separate utensils. So the separate utensils, if you wash them really well and there's no like cracks and grooves, you can get away with using the same ones, especially if they're like plastic or silicone. If it's like wooden spoons and there's like cracks and grooves, gluten can get into those. So it's best to keep like any wooden utensils separate. And cutting boards kind of the same idea. There's going to be cracks and grooves that happen, and typically gluten can get stuck in those, so it's better to be safe and just have something separate. Some other equipment that you can either have like a separate one for gluten-free cooking or just make sure you're washing really well include cast iron skillets, nonstick pans, rolling pins, food storage containers, waffle irons, muffin tins. Just make sure to not scrape these again because the gluten can get trapped. Use a separate grill if able. If you have a grill and there's gluten that's going onto it, you can always get like griddles that just go on top of the grill, just to keep for your gluten-free food. Or, if you know that there hasn't been any gluten served on it, just make sure that no gluten goes onto it. So maybe don't toast your buns for your burgers on the grill. Instead, do it in a pan or in the oven and just keep that grill completely gluten-free. Separate your foods in the fridge and pantry. So make sure to store any gluten-free foods on the top shelf so that if anything like spills, it spills onto the gluten-containing foods instead of the other way around where the gluten is being spilled onto the gluten-free foods. And then use separate condiments like butter, jam, peanut butter, or make sure to not double dip. A lot of times, you don't even think about like using the same butter knife. Even that crumb that's stuck on the butter knife from a gluten containing bread can still make somebody with celiac sick. And again, so these are more so tips for people that have celiac disease. With gluten intolerance, typically we don't see really a reaction from things like using the same equipment or things like that. So this is more specific to celiac disease. What about restaurants? So restaurants can be a little bit trickier to navigate because you're not in control of cooking the food, right? So do your research. Choose a restaurant that has gluten-free options. You can call them ahead of time to ask questions or to ask what gluten-free options they have available. When you're dining, inform your wait staff because they're going to be, the point of contact between you and the kitchen. Some people don't actually know what celiac disease is. I totally have used gluten allergy instead, and I see a lot of dietitians that work with celiac disease suggesting to their patients as well, just for the ease of it, tell them you have a gluten allergy. Sometimes it makes more sense to them that way because not everybody knows what celiac disease is. If you're finding that the wait staff doesn't quite know what you're talking about, isn't able to answer your questions, you can always ask to speak to the kitchen manager or the chef. They typically do have a lot more training than the wait staff in terms of allergens and cross contact and how to prevent those. So don't feel embarrassed if you have to ask them to bring out the manager or the chef because your safety is at risk, right? And if they do everything right and you're really happy with your meal, it's going to benefit them too, because then you can tell people that they did really well with managing, your food, your dietary restrictions, and that looks really good on them. So don't feel afraid to ask the questions, to go through all the motions, because at the end it benefits both you and the restaurant. So again, asking your questions about the ingredients and the preparation process, asking them to use clean equipment and gloves when preparing your food. Another cross contact point can be with fryers. So if you're having fried food, ask if they have a dedicated gluten-free fryer. A lot of times you'll see like French fries listed as gluten-free on the menu, but if they don't have a dedicated gluten-free fryer, that French fry is no longer safe, because if they're frying gluten-containing foods in that fryer, that's another point of cross contact, right? So making sure that they do have dedicated gluten-free fryers. Some restaurants have them, some restaurants don't. Asking those questions. And if you're in a situation where you don't get to choose the restaurant and they don't have any gluten-free options, you can always bring your own food from home if needed. Restaurants are totally fine if you just tell them, hey, I have a severe allergy. I didn't see anything on the menu that would meet my needs. I just brought my own food from home. They are more than happy to just let you be and enjoy your meal and have social time with everybody else. Okay. Another thing you can do is get these celiac disease cards. So you can buy these or you can make your own to give to restaurant staff, explaining what celiac disease is and what you can and cannot eat. So this is just one that I found on Amazon. Basically says, these are the foods that I can't eat. Does the food that I ordered contain gluten? And then I really like that it includes this caution: please use clean gloves, utensils, surfaces, cookware, and frying oil when preparing my meal. And this is in English. I actually found some in different languages, so this can be a really good option for when you're traveling as well, to just get some cards in the language that you know is spoken in the country you're traveling to, and handing them out to wait staff. And again, like your best bet is, if you're not sure if a food contains gluten, um, especially if it's something breaded or sauced, just stick to those foods that are naturally gluten-free. And then asking those questions about how it's prepared. Okay, what about like holidays and social eating? So honestly, there's so many different gluten-free recipes out there. You can find an alternative recipe for pretty much any holiday favorite or any recipe at this point. So experimenting with different recipes, trying them out, seeing which ones you like best. if you're not hosting, inform your host of your celiac disease or gluten sensitivity. Kind of give them a background of these are the foods that I can't have. If you have celiac disease, talk about the cross contact to make sure, that they can either make sure that there's no cross contact that happens, or that you might need to bring some extra food that you eat, right? Come prepared, bring a dish or two that you are sure that you can eat. Sometimes that can look like maybe you bring a couple of side dishes or something that looks more like a main dish. Or a lot of times we'll see, you're the one that brings the gluten-free dessert that everyone ends up liking more than the other desserts. That's typically what happens. You can buy pre-made gluten-free food if needed. I do this with holidays with things like dinner rolls, desserts. Like sometimes if I just don't feel like it, I'll buy a gluten-free pie. There's so many really great tasting options out there, actually. Just trying to hunt them down and trying different products to see what you like. Another tip, keep, gluten-free food separate to avoid cross contact, whether that's, at the end of the serving table, kind of separate from everything else, or in a different room, like maybe you put your gluten-free food in the kitchen and the rest of the food is in the dining room. Having different utensils, just trying to minimize cross contact as much as possible. And then be on the lookout for foods that may contain gluten. So a lot of times you'll see sauces and gravies, spices and drinks. Ask those questions if you're not the host. Try to look at the products, the labels. But it's better to be safe than sorry. So if you can't 100% say that this is a product that's gluten-free, it's just best to skip it. And then I also wanted to include some gluten-free resources for you guys. These are a lot of resources that I use that I really like and have found really helpful. So these are just some gluten-free cookbooks that I've used in the past. I'm really excited for the Art of Gluten-Free Bread that's coming out in September. This, I believe, there's going to be like 100 different recipes of breads and pastries and croissants, which if you have celiac or gluten intolerance, it's really, really hard to find a gluten-free croissant that actually tastes good. Some other ones, the America's Test Kitchen, How Can It Be Gluten-Free? Again, it's going to have a lot, I think it's like over 100 or 150 different recipes for pretty much anything that you can think of that contains gluten, making it gluten-free. And what I like about this cookbook, the America's Test Kitchen, is that they actually talked about the science of what is going on with that recipe and how the gluten-free ingredients are working together to get that texture that we know, right? If you are somebody that really likes Asian food and likes things like noodles and dumplings, The Very Hungry Celiac by Melanie Pearson. She has a dumpling wrapper recipe that is spot on. You can't even tell it's gluten-free. A lot of Asian dishes in this cookbook. I highly recommend it. It's probably my favorite that I have currently. And then some of these are some, beginner cookbooks that are really friendly. The Elements of Baking, a lot of the recipes are also vegan as well. So if that's something you want to experiment with, this is a really good cookbook to get. These are some websites that have gluten-free recipes. So a lot of them have everything from appetizers, entrees, snacks, desserts, breads, everything that you can think of. But these are just, right, it's not an exhaustive list. There's so many different ones out there. These are some of the ones that I have used in the past and have been really happy with the result. So do your own research, Google, try things, right? It's a really good thing to experiment with things. I also wanted to include some social media accounts, if that's something that you're interested in. So a lot of these are on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook. Erin, Kenny, and then Taylor are dietitians that have celiac disease and they work with people that have celiac disease. They do a lot of seminars and classes to teach you how to advocate for yourself, how to manage your celiac disease, just a lot of tips and tricks and things to do. These other people that I've included have celiac disease. And a lot of times they're sharing recipes, they're reviewing either gluten-free products that come out on the market or restaurants. And what I really like with these people is they're really transparent when something happens and they accidentally ingest gluten and how they manage it. Sometimes it can be really helpful if you're, newly diagnosed or have been dealing with celiac disease for a while to have somebody that is going through the same thing and learning from one another and being there as, allies in a world that is very heavily reliant on gluten. And then these last three, gluten intolerance group, Celiac Disease Foundation, Beyond Celiac. These are just organizations that work with celiac disease. They talk about research. Some of these will actually send out posts when there is like a recall that happens. That can be a really quick way to get word of recalls, and they just have really good resources. We actually they have websites as well, these groups, and a lot of the information from these slides are pulled from these organizations. And then there's also some useful apps out there that you can use. These are some of the ones that I have looked into and I have used in the past. Find Me Gluten Free. So this is an app that you can use to find restaurants and bakeries that have gluten-free option based on your location. You can leave reviews. A lot of people will leave comments about their experience. And it was created by somebody that has celiac disease. And a lot of people use it. I use it myself. It's really fun and really easy, right? The celiac app. So the celiac app was actually developed by Erin Kenny, which I mentioned with the social media accounts. So she's a dietitian. She developed this app to make it easier for herself and her clients. I will say, so this app, you can use it free for 2 weeks, and then there is, I believe, a monthly fee attached to it. But they do have product databases, they have gluten-free menus and guides for common restaurants. So a lot of chain restaurants, they'll tell you like how to order things or what items are gluten-free on the menu. They have practice scripts for dining out, FAQs about celiac disease, and they just updated their app and now they have an in-app assistant. So you can literally ask your question in the in-app assistant and they'll answer, so like Chat GPT. It's really, really cool, so I highly encourage you to check it out. This Fig food scanner, so you can scan barcodes of food products or look up the food item to check for ingredients. And then it'll tell you each individual ingredient if it's gluten-free, so you can learn about the different ingredients, like where they're typically sourced from. And it'll tell you if something is safe or not. Gluten Dude, so similar to Find Me Gluten Free. It's an app to find gluten-free restaurants based on your location, and you can leave reviews as well. And this Atlee, so it is, Atlee is an app to find restaurants. They do have a gluten-free filter that works really well. This is one of the newer apps that I've seen. So just using that filter to find gluten-free restaurants based on your location. And I believe that the apps that find restaurants and bakeries, they do typically work for the US only. There might be some that work in like places like Italy, Spain, France, where they're a little bit better at distinguishing between gluten containing foods and gluten-free. Fun fact, Italy is a really good place to vacation to if you have celiac disease because they have a really high population that has celiac disease. It's just one of their genetic things that goes on in the Italian population. So that's a fun tip. If you ever want to go somewhere and you have celiac disease, Italy is the place to go. All right, and these are the references that we use to gather all this information. I highly encourage you, if you're new to celiac disease or want to learn more about gluten intolerance, to look through these websites and see what you can find. A lot of them have recipes, a lot of them talk about new research that's coming out with celiac disease or new studies that are starting, if you ever want to participate. Yeah. So thank you so much for watching. We do have about 15 minutes for questions. So I do see some questions in the chat. So I'm just going to read these out, but feel free to add more. Okay, so I heard some people with gluten intolerance might actually have a sensitivity to glyphosate or glyphosate. They said because they can eat bread in other countries, they don't dry their grains with glyphosate. Any truth to this? So I knew this question was going to come up. So, I think it's really individual in terms of how people react to pesticides. So typically, it's really hard to figure out if you're actually reacting to the pesticide or not. And the reality is, in other countries, they might not necessarily use this pesticide, but they do use other pesticides. So, you'll hear a lot of people that say, well, I can't eat bread in the US, but I can totally eat bread in Italy. And there's a couple of things that's happening with that. First of all, in Europe or other countries, they might have different strains of grains that they're using. A lot of times they're using ancient strains of grains that a lot of people react a lot better to. So that could be what's going on. Another thing that I see happening a lot is, people when they travel, they're a lot more relaxed than they are when they're at home. They're a lot less stressed, and stress can really impact your GI health. So if you're constantly stressed, if you're constantly, for example, you're stressed when you're at work and that's when you eat gluten and you notice a reaction, sometimes when we take stress out of the equation, that reaction goes away. So a lot of times what I'll see is people go on vacation, they're less stressed, they can eat the gluten because their GI system is just working better. So it could be, you're reacting to the what they're spraying the wheat with, but oftentimes it's a little more complicated than that. And I do want to say, so this only applies to gluten intolerance where you can try to eat where you're somewhere else. This does not apply to celiac disease. Gluten is gluten and it's going to make you sick regardless of where you eat it. Right? Okay. Where do I get a food marble device test? So currently you can order it online. That is pretty much the only place where you can order it. It comes, when you get the device, it comes with an app too, that can help read like the results from the breath tests. And then the food marble device, like it doesn't expire, it doesn't have like any strips or anything like that. Like you can use it for life, basically. Some gluten-free baked goods seem to cause issues for me. Is this a clue that fructan might be the problem and not gluten? So yes, absolutely. This could be what's going on. Or it could be that you're actually sensitive to something else that is in the gluten-free product. You'll see with a lot of gluten-free products because um, there's no gluten, there's nothing to provide that product with structure. They typically have to add things like starches and gums and things like that that some people react to, some people don't. So if if you're finding that you're having issues with even with gluten-free baked goods, it might be worth working with a dietitian to kind of zero it down and figure out what is actually going on and what exactly are you reacting to. Hey, that was the last of the questions. Any other questions? Christina, I actually can't see the Q&A. I only see the chat. If there's any questions in there, can you read them out?
I don't see any Q&A questions right now.
Okay.
Yeah, it looks
Well,
like there aren't any Q&A questions. So if anyone has any other questions, the Q&A is anonymous, I should say, um, on the end of the participant. So if you have any questions that you'd like to throw in there, then please feel free to.
and you will be getting a recording of this webinar and also the slides as well. So you can always, do more research on your own if that's something that's interesting.
Yes, thank you, Anka, for sharing that. I will get those to everyone hopefully tomorrow morning so you can revisit any of that information. Looks like some good feedback in the comments. So, and if you guys have any more questions, feel free to pop those into the chat. And while we're waiting, I just want to say thank you to the both of you and to everyone who was able to join us live this evening. As you're logging off, we do have a quick 6-question survey that pops up on your screen. If you have any thoughts on future classes or any feedback from this class, we love to hear it. So that survey is a great opportunity to share. Otherwise, we have lots of classes with sound dietitians coming up. And so if you want to check out our website, stillyvalleyhealth.org, you can see all of the exciting webinars and things that we have in the next couple of months here. Otherwise, thank you guys. And that's all I have for now. Please feel free to add anything else.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you to everyone that joined. Hopefully you learned a lot. Yeah, I just encourage you to remain curious and try new things.
I don't see any more questions. Are you okay if we wrap up here?
Yeah, I think so.
All right. Well, thank you guys again, and I hope to see you at future presentations. Have a good night.
Thank you for having us. Bye.